It began beneath a sky of iron. The summer of 1346 had turned the fields of northern France into dust and ruin. Villages smoldered in the distance, their smoke drifting across the plains, like silent witnesses of a kingdom at war. For a year, King Edward III of England had marched through Normandy, burning, raiding, and claiming the crown he believed was his by right. Behind him trailed an army of 12,000 English and Welsh soldiers, hardened by rain, hunger, and fire. Now, their long campaign had brought them here to a small village called Crécy en Ponthieu, a place soon to be written into the bones of history. Across the fields, a greater storm gathered. The banners of France rose like a forest of color and steel. King Philip VI led a host that dwarfed the English numbers 20,000, perhaps 30, knights, squires, mercenaries, and the blind King of Bohemia himself. They came for glory, for vengeance, for the pride of France. But Edward did not retreat. He chose the hill above Crécy, a ridge between a forest and a marsh, and told his men to hold it. He ordered the knights to fight on foot, shoulder to shoulder with their archers. No horses, no charges, only discipline, and faith in the ground they stood upon. As the sun sank, the English dug ditches and drove wooden stakes into the mud. The longbowmen tested their strings, their fingers rough and scarred. In the distance, thunder rolled over the horizon. When night came, the windmill on the hill turned slowly, its blades cutting through the dusk like the hands of fate itself. And in the darkness, two kingdoms waited for dawn. Dawn came heavy with mist. From the ridges near Crécy, the English saw the land below shimmer with steel. The French host had arrived vast, restless, and radiant, beneath a bruised gray sky. At their head rode Philip VI of France, wearing a golden crown above his helmet. Beside him, the blind King John of Bohemia, led by his knights, a man who could no longer see the world, yet refused to stand aside while others fought for it. Around them, the banners of Europe fluttered in the morning wind, and blue, crimson, and black, each crest a promise of honor, each soon to be swallowed by the smoke of war. The French army stretched to the horizon. There were Genoese mercenaries, hired crossbowmen from the southern seas. There were French nobles in armor bright as mirrors, their plumes rising like flames, and behind them, a tide of men-at-arms, squires, and horsemen, an army of kings, bound by pride more than by command. The English, by contrast, stood silent. Edward's army numbered barely 12,000, 4,000 men at arms, 7,000 archers, and 5,000 spearmen from England and Wales. They carried no illusions. They were outnumbered, perhaps 3 to 1, but they had discipline and something new. In the center, strange bronze tubes glimmered in the weak light, the first English cannon ever brought to a battlefield. Crude, unreliable, yet capable of a sound no man of that age could forget. The king rode along the lines, his cloak dark with dew. He saw men sharpening blades with calm resolve, bowstrings stretched, stakes fixed in the soil. The archers stood barefoot in the mud, their arrows planted before them like a forest of death. They waited quiet, the scent deadly. Then came the rain. A sudden storm swept across the plain, drenching both armies in cold sheets of water. The Genoese crossbowmen cursed the heavens, their bowstrings slackened, their bolts warped. Worse still, they had left their great shields, their pavises, far behind with the baggage wagons. And as lightning flashed over the French lines, Philip VI raised the Oriflamme, the sacred crimson banner of Saint Denis. It meant no quarter, no mercy, no prisoners. The French cheered. The English waited. Above them, thunder echoed through the sky. But it was not the storm that would break first. When the rain passed, the world stood still. The wind faded, and only the dripping of water from armor and branches filled the silence. The fields of Crécy had turned to mud-soft, treacherous, and waiting. King Edward rode to the crest of the hill, his face calm, his eyes fixed upon the distant banners of France. Behind him, the windmill turned slowly, its creaking blades marking the rhythm of fate. He had chosen his ground, carefully high, narrow, and deadly, a place not for gallant charges, but for endurance. Then came his order, quiet yet final. Every knight would dismount. Every man, noble or common, would fight on foot. It was a command that defied centuries of pride. Knights had always ruled the battlefield from horseback, armored in faith and arrogance, their lances symbols of divine right. Yet Edward saw what others would not, that the world was changing. Steel and courage alone could not stand against the precision of order. And so, under his banner, the sons of England stood side by side archers, men at arms, and lords alike, equal before the mud and death that awaited them. They drove sharpened stakes into the earth to stop the cavalry. They dug shallow trenches and scattered caltrops along the slope. The longbowmen tested their strings once more, oiling the hemp, feeling its tension between calloused fingers. Across the line, fires burned low. Men ate in silence, their faces pale beneath the dawn. Below the ridge, the French lines shimmered with restless motion, thousands of men shifting, horses stamping in the mud, the sound of impatience rolling like thunder before the storm. The French believed they faced an exhausted enemy, cornered, weary, and ready to break. They did not see what Edward had built, not a camp of refugees, but a machine of war. To the king, this was not merely a battle, it was a lesson. He was teaching his son, the 16-year-old Prince Edward, the nature of command, the price of victory, and the patience of power. The prince stood in the center, beneath his banner of 3 white feathers, his armor new, his courage untested. Edward watched him for a long moment, saying nothing. He did not need to. The ground would teach him more than any words could. As the morning lengthened, the sky cleared. The field before Crécy glimmered under the sun, a sea of wet grass, pools of water, and thousands of waiting souls. Somewhere far off, a trumpet sounded from the French vanguard. The English held their breath. Edward raised one hand. No speeches, no prayers, only silence. A silence sharper than any sword. For in that silence, the king had already decided he would not yield, not retreat, and not play the game of noble chivalry. He would let the enemy come to him wave upon wave, until pride itself shattered on the discipline of men who refused to move. And when the wind shifted once more, carrying the faint scent of rain and iron across the field, Edward III looked to the horizon and whispered to none but the storm, "Let them come." Afternoon descended upon Crécy like a curtain of heat and dread. The fields still glistened from the morning rain, every blade of grass slick with mud and blood yet to be spilled. Across the valley, the air trembled with the rumble of drums and the whinnies of impatient horses. The storm had broken, and this time it would be made of men. The first to move were the Genoese crossbowmen. They advanced with shouts, their armor dull under the fading sun, the air filled with the creak of their bows winding, the hiss of bolts loosed into the sky. But their shots fell short damp streams, ruined by the rain. Their bolts splashed harmlessly into the mud. From the ridge above, the answer came like the wrath of heaven, a sound no man of that age had ever heard before. The roar of cannon, small, primitive guns, belched smoke and fire, their echoes rolling like thunder through the valley. And then came the real storm, the English longbows. Thousands of arrows screamed from the hill, blackening the air. They fell in sheets fast, relentless, merciless. Horses reared, men stumbled, and the Genoese line broke in terror. Shields dropped, pavis abandoned. Panic rippled through their ranks as arrows pierced flesh. armor, and earth alike. They turned and ran, but behind them thundered the French knights. To Philip's men, retreat was shame, and mercy was weakness. In fury, the cavalry spurred forward, cutting down their own mercenaries as they fled. The cries of the Genoese vanished beneath the iron tide that followed them. The first wave of French knights charged uphill, banners snapping, lances leveled. Their hooves churned the field into mire. The English archers drew and loosed each arrow a whisper of death. Horses crashed to the ground, tumbling their riders beneath. Men-at-arms stepped forward with axes and swords, finishing what the archers had begun. The second wave followed, and then a third. Each met the same end. The air became a wall of noise, steel clashing, men screaming, the groan of dying beasts. Arrows stuck in the ground like iron thorns. Piles of bodies grew before the English line, a grotesque rampart of flesh and armor. Still, they came. The Oriflamme, the crimson banner of no mercy, fluttered above the chaos, urging the knights onward. Their courage was beyond question, but courage alone was helpless against precision. Wave after wave broke upon the hill like surf against rock. By sunset, 15 assaults had been thrown back. The field below was no longer earth, only churned mud, broken weapons, and the silence of those who would never rise again. At the crest of the ridge, King Edward watched in silence, the windmill turning behind him. The smoke stung his eyes, yet he did not look away. He had built a wall of discipline, and it was holding, far below. The banner of his son, the young Black Prince, still stood amid the storm. His men fought like shadows in firelight, their blades flashing through smoke and blood. The French were still coming, but slower now, uncertain, crushed beneath the weight of their own dead. The sun dipped beyond the horizon. Crécy burned red, and as night approached, the battlefield itself seemed to breathe alive, groaning, changing as if the world was learning, in one terrible hour, that the age of knights was ending. Night crept over Crécy like a shroud. The air hung heavy with smoke, rain, and the stench of iron. The cries of the wounded echoed across the fields, faint, endless, like ghosts refusing to leave. The sun had fallen, yet the battle had not. Down the slope, the Black Prince still held his ground, barely 16, his armor dented and dark with blood. He stood amid the wreckage of France's pride. Around him, men-at-arms fought in the torchlight, faces blackened by soot, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The English lines swayed under the last waves of assault. Far above, on the ridge, King Edward III watched from beneath the windmill. The hill was silent, save for the crackle of fires and the distant clash of steel. He saw the smoke rise from where his son's banner still flickered the 3 white feathers of the Prince of Wales. A messenger broke from the darkness, mud splattering beneath his horse's hooves. He reached the king's side and fell to one knee, gasping for air. The prince, he said, was surrounded, pressed hard by the enemy. He begged for aid. The king did not move. He turned his gaze to the chaos below and listened to the storm of battle. Then, with calm that chilled even his captains, he spoke. Let the boy win his spurs. No reinforcements were sent. The young prince would stand or fall by his own hand, and so he fought on, through the dark. The English arrows still flew, silver in the firelight. Swords clanged, armor split, men fell, screaming into the mud. The prince's standard-bearer was cut down beside him. Another took his place without a word. The boy who had never known war now stood at its center and did not yield. Then, through the smoke, came a sight no one would forget. King John of Bohemia, blind and aged, called for his horse. He could not see the carnage, but he could feel the dishonor of standing still while others died. He ordered his knights to tie their bridles together, one to another, and to lead him into battle. They obeyed. 5 men rode as one, a chain of valor bound by death. They charged straight into the English line. The impact was brief, violent, and final. None returned. When dawn came, their bodies were found still bound together, their reins knotted, their armor pierced. Around them lay hundreds of fallen knights who had followed in vain. The Oriflamme, once blazing with divine promise, now lay trampled and torn in the mud. The banner of no mercy had met the discipline of a new age and perished. In the pale light of morning, Philip VI's courage faltered. Twice his horse had been killed beneath him. Twice he had risen again, his armor shattered, his crown dented. But at last, the King of France was forced to flee. Behind him, the plain of Crécy lay in ruin, a graveyard of armor and pride. And as the windmill turned slowly in the dawn, Edward III lowered his head. The battle was won, but what lay before him was no triumph. It was the death of an age and the birth of another. Morning rose cold and colorless over Crécy. The storm had passed, yet its silence was more terrible than its fury. The mist clung low to the ground, veiling the dead in a ghostly shroud. No drums, no horns, only the distant cry of crows circling above the field that had devoured 2 kingdoms in a single day. The English soldiers moved through the carnage like shadows. Everywhere they looked, the world was broken, armor twisted, horses sprawled in grotesque stillness, banners torn and buried beneath the mire. The smell of wet earth mixed with blood hung in the air, thick enough to choke the living. The king's men gathered what remained of their comrades, a mere 300 fallen. For an army so small, it was a miracle. For the French, it was annihilation. More than 1,500 knights lay dead, and thousands more men-at-arms. Among them, the pride of France, the Count of Alençon, the Duke of Lorraine, the Lord of Flanders, and the blind King of Bohemia, the Black Prince, exhausted yet unbroken, walked among the bodies with the same calm that had carried him through the night. His armor was black with ash and blood, his eyes hollow but alive. Around him, his men spoke in whispers, their voices trembling with awe. They found the body of King John near the English line. He was still tied to the bridles of his knights, his hands locked on the hilt of his sword, his face turned toward the dawn he would never see. The prince stood over him for a long time. He did not speak, but those who watched saw reverence in his gaze. From the fallen king's helm, 3 ostrich feathers were taken white, delicate, unbent by the storm. The prince placed them on his own crest. From that day onward, those feathers would mark the heir to the English throne, a quiet tribute to the courage of a man who had died for honor, not victory. Nearby, the Oriflamme, once a banner of divine vengeance, lay trampled into the mud. Its red silk was now dark as wine. No one raised it again. King Edward rode slowly down the hill, his horse stepping carefully through the ruin. He did not smile. He did not boast. He simply removed his helm and looked upon the battlefield with the silence of a man who had seen the world change before his eyes. The archers sat in the mud, staring into nothing. Their quivers were empty, their hands blistered, their faces streaked with soot and rain. Some wept quietly, others prayed. For every arrow that had flown, a man had fallen, and now, in the stillness of dawn, even the victors felt the weight of their own power. The valley of Crécy had become a graveyard not only for the knights who fell, but for the old order itself. The thunder of hooves had been silenced by the hiss of arrows, and the shining code of chivalry had drowned in its own blood. Above it all, the windmill turned once more, slow and patient, grinding the dust of glory into history. As the sun climbed over the hills of Ponthieu, the valley of Crécy lay motionless, a wound carved into the flesh of Europe. Crows gathered in black circles above the fallen, their cries echoing across the silent plain. The air smelled of iron and smoke, of pride, turned to dust. Yet beneath that silence, something far greater than victory had taken root. The Battle of Crécy was not merely the triumph of one king over another, it was the death of an age. For centuries, war had been the domain of nobles. Mounted knights, armored in faith and vanity, had ruled the field through birthright and bravado. But here on this muddy ridge in northern France, their legend was broken by men of humble birth, by archers in leather and mud, by the cold logic of discipline and range. The longbow had spoken louder than the lance. The will of the common soldier had stood firmer than the charge of 1,000 horses, and the first echo of gunpowder, those crude English cannons that had roared across the field, whispered of a new era yet to come, when thunder and smoke would command the fate of empires. For France, Crécy was humiliation. For England, it was revelation. But for the world, it was evolution. The battlefield had shifted from glory to geometry, from valor to velocity, from courage to calculation. In the years that followed, songs of chivalry grew quieter, replaced by the steady march of armies built on order and invention. The age of knights, of banners and vows, had begun its long descent into memory, and yet, the men who stood that day, both English and French, left more than corpses behind. They left the proof that courage endures even when ideals collapse. That honor may die in form, but not in spirit. As the sun set once more over Crécy, the ridge glowed gold beneath its light. The wind carried no cheers,
In this
no
battle,
cries, only the
world
soft hum of
changed.
time moving forward, indifferent, unstoppable. The windmill still turned above the valley, its blade sweeping through dust and memory. Below it lay the bones of two worlds, one ending and one beginning. On that field, history didn't end. It transformed.